let's take some time to review opposites and absolute values. Our goal for today is that at the end of this lesson, you should be able to determine the opposite of a number. So what is a number opposite, or what is the opposite of a specific number? So here's kind of the best definition that you can have, is when the numbers are added together, you should get 0. When the numbers are added together, you should get 0. In other words, it means that both numbers are an equal distance from 0 on both sides of the number line. So both numbers are an equal distance from 0 on the number line. But in opposite directions. Opposite directions. That was a lot, sorry. So here we have -6, here we have +6. Jumping from -6 up to 0 is a total distance of 6. Remember, in distance we use the absolute values. And then jumping from +6 to 0 is also a movement of 6. So it's going to be that same distance. So you should notice that -6 is that same distance from 0 on the number line as 6 is. They're just in two opposite directions. The two opposite directions are obviously left versus right. So something else to remember, another definition or another vocab word that you might see used as opposite is additive inverse. So we've talked about inverse operation as in being opposite. So a number opposite is also known as an additive, A-D-D-I-T-I-V-E, inverse. Remember, inverse means opposite, just like a number opposite. Additive inverse just means that when you add them together, they're going to end up at 0. So let's try a few of these examples. This first example up here at the top where we looked at -6 and 6, if we were to add those up, remember, when we add two numbers or two integers that have the opposite sign, we want to actually subtract them but keep the sign of the larger number. Well, when you do 6 minus 6, you get 0, and 0 is neither positive nor negative. It just stays the same. The other example is down at the bottom. What is the opposite of -10? The opposite of any negative number is going to be that same number, but in positive form. So it would just be 10. And then what's the opposite of 21? It's going to be that same number, but since this is in positive form, it's going to be in negative form. Now let's talk about some absolute values. So we want to be able to, in this part of the lesson, determine the absolute value of a number. Determine the absolute value of a number. So, well, what is the absolute value? The absolute value is the distance from 0 on the number line. It doesn't matter which direction you're going. Anytime we talk about distance, we talk about it in absolute value form. So when we're talking about the distance of a number from 0, it's always going to be positive. So distance is always positive. That's something we should always remember. So if we're over here at -6, the absolute value, remember absolute value is marked by those two lines Just to review from opposite, opposite is done with a negative sign with a number inside. So you could have the opposite of 6, which is negative 6, or you could have the opposite of negative 6, which is positive 6. So this sign outside the parentheses signals opposite. These lines, on the other hand, signal absolute value. So the absolute value of negative 6 is the distance of negative 6 to 0, which we know to jump from negative 6 to 0 is a distance of 6. Therefore, the absolute value of negative 6 is 6. The absolute value of 3, 1, 2, 3, here's our 3 on the number line. Our distance, our amount of hops to get to 0, is simply 3. Therefore, the absolute value of 3 is still 3. So something to keep in mind is that when we're finding absolute values, if there was a negative sign outside of the absolute value sign, let's look at what that means. So if there's a negative outside of the absolute value, bars, the number remains negative. And let's talk about why that is. Let's look at example number 2 first. We're going to look right here at example number 2. This right here, these bars are saying absolute value, yet this negative sign is saying opposite. So if I was to read you what that problem said, it would say the opposite of the absolute value of 4. So starting off, what is the absolute value of 4? The absolute value of 4 is simply 4. What is the opposite of that? It is negative 4. Therefore, our answer there should be negative 4. So here we have an absolute value sign, but it ends up being negative simply because it has the opposite sign outside of it. Going back to example number 1, we've got just the absolute value of negative 10, which we know is just simply the distance from, negative 12, from negative 12 to 0, which we know has a distance of 12. So the absolute value of negative 12 is 12. It is positive 12. I hope you guys can understand and determine the opposites and absolute values of numbers.